So, more about monads, looking at the metaphysics of our good dead friend, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, one of the famous features of monads, or rather lack of feature, is that they are windowless. So what does he mean by this? Well, these monads, these metaphysical points, they do not interact at all. Each one is utterly self-enclosed and utterly self-sufficient, as we'll see, aside from being created by God. And of course, God is utterly self-sufficient. So why do we call them windowless monads? Well, in the monadology, Leibniz says the following, translated, of course, into English. The monads have no windows through which anything can enter or depart. So the point is not like they lack, windows in the sense of not having windows. The point of the metaphor is that there's no opening, so to speak, through which anything can enter or depart. They're totally self-contained. Now, another feature of the monads, in addition to being windowless, is that each monad mirrors or represents all of the world. And for Leibniz, in his discussion of the problem of evil, he claims there's only one world. The possible worlds he talks about, in his famous quote about this is the best of all possible worlds, those other worlds are not real. God conceives of them, but only creates this world, the best one. So there wouldn't be other realities. So each monad mirrors all of reality. Although, of course, as I mentioned last time, talking about like the monads that make up your sock, their clarity varies quite a bit. And so there is no split, no dichotomy between the inner world of your experience and the outer world. This avoids, of course, the classic, problem raised by skeptics and others, which is how does something outside your mind enter into your experience? So it solves that problem in the sense that nothing comes from the outside world into your inner world. Again, we'll talk about obviously God later, and God creates everything as one would expect, but nothing comes from the outside to the inside. We're perfectly isolated in ourselves. It also avoids the classic skeptical problem of the external world, which is this. The problem of the external world is, how do I know that what I'm experiencing in my mind matches what is out there? The problem we see in the classic 1999 movie, The Matrix, later in Inception, and of course in a wide range of TV shows, books, movies, etc. The classic skeptical problem. And it solves that problem because there's no problem about my experiencing matching external objects out there, because strictly speaking, there are no external objects corresponding to what I'm experiencing. They're just my experiences. And of course, other monads. So the minds, of course, us, we also have a world that we represent to ourselves, our internal world. And we are, on Leibniz's view, in one sense, utterly and perfectly isolated, because your mind and all the experiences in it are utterly separate. The mind is utterly unbreachable in this sense. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Also, the inner experience of each of us is different. Again, going back to Leibniz's law we saw earlier, no two monads are identical. So all of us are unique. We're all different. But our inner experiences, because maybe wondering, like, are we like in some sort of isolated, hell where there's no correspondence between what goes on in one's mind and anything else? Well, fortunately, according to Leibniz, no. What your experience, what I'm experiencing, the contents of our minds do correspond with each other. So there is no causal interaction, but there is correspondence. The good question would be, what does that mean? Well, here's the answer. So the gist of this is that the monads are, again, utterly self-enclosed. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Your experiences are all your own. But I've also said that somehow your experiences correspond with the experiences of others. So what could that mean? Well, this takes us to the notion of pre-established harmony. So, on Leibniz's view, there's no external world beyond each of our mind's experiences. I mean, if Leibniz is right, yes, there's an infinite number of other monads, so none of us are alone in that sense. But outside the monads, aside from other monads, there's nothing. So how do we have these experiences? Well, as I alluded to earlier, it's God. It's, for philosophers during this time period, if they were not atheists like their good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, God always did a whole bunch in their metaphysics. So here's how it works, at least according to Leibniz. God creates each monad. And what he does when he creates it is he places within each monad all its experiences forever within it. To use an analogy, think of your experiences as like the movie of your life, and you have a metaphysical storage system in your mind. Not a separate part, because for Leibniz, the monads are simple, but imagine you have the capability to store, vast amounts of movies. And so what God does when God creates you, within your mind is every experience you're going to have. And the same for everyone else. Within my mind, every experience I'm going to have is already in there from the moment of my creation. And same for every other monad. The monads that make up your sock, or, say you're having a sandwich right now, the monads that make up that sandwich, they have all their experiences in them forever. And what happens is that what we call the universe unfolds within each of us from our perspective. So your life plays out, from within you, giving you all these experiences. You're living your movie, but from your perspective. To use an analogy to video games, it's like you're playing a video game and the entire video game is already in there from your first person perspective. And same thing from everybody else. They're experiencing the universe that God has put in there from their perspective. Now, we're all, despite the fact that nothing gets in and nothing gets out, we're all connected. So to quote Leibniz, translated English of course, each body feels all that happens in the universe. So he who sees all might read in each what happens everywhere. And it's kind of an interesting notion that somehow you could, see a grain of sand, which would be a monad, or monads collected together. And if you could see, somehow metaphysically, you would see the entire universe in that grain of sand. So, interesting view. We reflect everything else. So in a way, we're all isolated, but we're also connected, all created by God, and we all feel what happens to everything and everyone else. But each monad, of course, contains its own, what Leibniz calls an internal principle of activity, what he calls appetition, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing. The idea is this, that appetition or appetition, English is terrible, this is an inner drive towards self-development. Now, some creatures, like us, have a conscious quality of this appetition, and that would be our purpose or will. We're conscious, we're willing things. But he accepts that even monads that are not conscious, again, everything is a mind, but not all minds are conscious, they're all driven by these internal desires. And so it's very similar to our good dead friend Aristotle in many ways. Namely, everything has a goal or a purpose. In our case, we have a conscious will, and we're aware of at least some of our purposes, some of our wants. But for example, the monads making up your sock or your sandwich, they would not. They are still driven by internal desires, but they're not, conscious and aware of it. Or so he claims. So we have a purposeful universe in which we're all isolated, we're all created by God, but we feel what happens to everything else. And we're driven by, this need, this purpose or will driven towards self-development, to be, I guess, all we can be. So one of the classic questions aimed at Leibniz is, of course, this. It's a bit of a problem. Are all the monads experiencing the same world, or are we all in utter isolation in our own separate worlds? Which in a way you could think of as maybe a nightmare scenario where you are utterly alone, everything you're experiencing is unreal, a delusion. Which, could be, with the proper music and lighting and so forth, could be a good episode of like Black Mirror, or, back when it was good, or something like a Twilight Zone episode in which we find out, we're all in a prison that's all utterly isolated and none of this is real. Ooh, scary stuff. Or are we experiencing the same world? So Leibniz's answer is this. Yes, we are utterly isolated, but we are experiencing, can't really say the same world, but we're experiencing corresponding experiences. And this is done by God. When God created the monads, he made it so each of us monads, our experiences play out in sync. Not like the band, but they play out, together. And so, to use a metaphor, all our videos are playing in sync because God's, put them in there and, he's got the clocks all lined up. And Leibniz uses two analogies or metaphors. One is the analogy of a musician. You can imagine a musician, each one in their own room, but playing from the same score and following, a synchronized metronomes, that these metronomes have been synced up. So they know, like, okay, exactly this moment, play this note, the other musician plays, their note. And interestingly, this is kind of how quite a bit of music is being done now, because of this is being recorded during the pandemic of 2020, and musicians, many of them are recording on their own, in their own room, following, a score, and then these are all assembled into, a unified piece of music. Another analogy used is two synchronized clocks. So if you have two clocks and they sync up, then even though they're not, causing each other to tick away, they'll tick in sync. You can also use the example of, synchronizing, videos being played on, two iPads. To use a modern example, you could have the videos in there. As long as the play is pushed at the same time, they'll play out. And God ensures that whatever you're experiencing matches up with whatever relevant experiences are occurring in the monads around you. So, for example, if you go to take a bite out of the sandwich, you have your movie playing as if you're biting a sandwich, and the monads that make up the sandwich, their movie is playing that they are getting bitten. Rough break for the sandwich. Similarly for like the sock example, when you put on your sock and your inner movie is playing of your putting on the sock, and the inner movies of the monads making up the sock is playing that they're being put on. Or if you're talking to another person, God has got this, synced up. So the movie playing in your mind is, for the situation from your perspective, and then the movie playing in their mind is a situation from their perspective. So here I am sitting here talking, and my mind is, playing out this preset, movie in my mind, but it corresponds to, if I was talking to somebody, they would be having that, comparable experience as if I were talking to them. So you can kind of think of God as the great sync. Each of us is like an iPad with all our movies in there, and then they play in sync, or so he claims. Now, you may be thinking, what about space? What about time? Now, given that these monads are not extended, so they don't have any spatial dimensions, and they're indivisible, how do we have any experience of what seems to be extended things? And we talk about extension, three-dimensionality. So what Leibniz does, he says extension is like a rainbow. How so? Well, a rainbow is not a unified entity. It's not a thing, but it's an appearance based on a number of, that arises from a number of water drops and light, etc. So for him, extension is not a real property. It's not a real thing, but it's simply a way things appear to our minds. And he does, an explanation that is essentially drawn from art. And to use the obvious analogy, what seems to be extension for him would be a repetition of similar monads. This is how, if you're familiar with like painting or drawing, or video games, 3D video games, obviously your screen on your computer switch is not three-dimensional, but you can have the appearance of this depth, playing a 3D game, or looking at a drawing or a 3D movie. And of course it's an illusion. And it's created by, how you use, the colors and size and stuff. And so Leibniz essentially says, yeah, what seems to be extension is essentially the same techniques we would think of being used in art. And so the techniques of art would be exactly the same that are used to create reality. So more on space and time. So space and time don't exist apart from our experiences. We organize them spatially and temporally. Now, for our good dead friend, Sir Isaac Newton, he tended to present space like a container, a box, in which we keep our stuff. So if everything were taken out of space, we'd still have space left. So space would be, a thing to keep your stuff in. But for Leibniz, space is not a thing. It's not an entity. It is a system of relationships between all those elements of experience. Again, to use an analogy to like a video game, there's no space in like World of Warcraft or Death Stranding or Skyrim or Minecraft or Animal Crossing, because it's occurring on a effectively two-dimensional screen. But you have an experience that's based on relationships between your experiences. So if you're playing a video game and your character is moving through like a city like Stormwind or something, or you're playing Call of Duty going through the map in a city, you're not like really moving, but you have a series of experiences that are related together that create the seeming experience of moving, of being in space. So video games actually are pretty good for explaining how space would work for Leibniz. Just like you experience space that's really not space in video games, you can experience space that's really not space in your mind. Now, he also takes time to be relative as well. So time doesn't exist as a thing. It's a measure of the successive relationships between our experienced events. So we're measuring, what we experience, and that gives us our, what we call time. So space and time are relative to us. Now, we don't want to, it'd be a mistake to attribute to Leibniz, Einsteinian theory of relativity, like, ooh, he got this before Einstein. But it is, kind of an interesting setup that presumably was later probably had some influence on Einstein. The idea of non-absolute space and time, the idea that it could be relative. That didn't come out of nowhere. Einstein didn't just produce that ex nihilo, obviously. Now, Leibniz also looks at the mind-body problem, because he considers it a serious problem for Descartes. So if there's a serious problem for a theory, then another theory that's competing with it has to presumably at least say something about it. Maybe the problem won't apply to the competing theory, in which case, good for that theory. So how does he solve the mind-body problem? Again, that's a problem of how does the mind control or interact with the body. So here's how he fixes it, or at least according to him. So what are physical bodies? What would be your body, like you normally think of, like you're touching like your leg or your arm, your foot? What would that be? What would be physical objects, like, say you're sitting in a chair now. You may be looking at a computer or holding your iPad or phone or something. Again, maybe you get a sandwich. What are all those things? Well, again, for Leibniz, physical bodies are really just collections of monads. They're just a whole bunch of monads. Now, some, like a bunch of sand, like a desert, lots of sand, would be mere aggregates because they're not really unified. You just got a bunch of sand. But obviously, like a human being, like you or I, we're more complicated than sand. We're unified. And, objects like buildings as well. Now, for Leibniz, organic bodies, like you or I, we're communities of monads whose activities are in harmony with those of the dominant monad, which would be the soul or mind of the being. So, one way to think of this metaphorically is that you are the monad, you're the mind, the soul or mind, and then sort of connected to it, linked somehow, are all the monads that make up your body. And they're in this special harmony with those monads. To use an obvious metaphor analogy, if you think of yourself as like your brain, and then all the rest of the cells that make up your body would be like those other monads. So roughly put, you can kind of think of it like a figure made up of a bunch of circles, or imagine like a human figure made up of a bunch of balls, just human shaped collection of balls. And metaphorically speaking, the head would be the central monad, the soul, that would be the person, and all the rest would be the other lesser monads that make it up. So what are the relationships between the monads that make up your body and you? Well, according to Leibniz, you experience the monads that make up your body with the most clarity. Like your hand monads, they're much clearer to you than, say, the monads of, like if you're looking at like your desk, But it's important to note for Leibniz, there's still no causal interaction between you, your mind, and the body monads. Why? Well, again, Leibniz says monads are windowless. So even though you are your soul and you have this body made of monads, there's actually no interaction between them. So you're not interacting with your hand or your spleen or your liver. They're just monads that are kind of, they can't really be like hanging out with you in a way because there's no like space. They're just kind of metaphorically close to you. But fortunately, they all sync up. Again, how does this work? Well, pre-established harmony. So for example, when you think, when your inner movie is playing out that you're moving your hand, say to turn off this video or to get a snack, then the hand monads and arm monads all are acting, in pre-established harmony. So that way everything is synced up. So when you reach and, say grab your glass of drink, all the monads making up your body, metaphorically speaking, because they're all just monads, they're all in sync, going through all that stuff from their perspective. So you're perceiving your hand from your perspective, your hand is perceiving you from its perspective, the cup is perceiving your hand from its perspective, everything's perceiving everything, all in harmony. Now, Leibniz thinks this solves a mind-body problem because there's no interaction between anything, it's just the movies are all playing and God has got it all synced up. So he thinks problem solved. There's no shell for the ghost to control, there's no causal interaction, he thinks problem solved, or so he claims.